Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode, we started the book by Michael McCartney entitled The Macs. It was a great beginning. We got to see how Paul and Michael's parents got together and how they were as parents. So let's see what happens next. Mike remembered his school days. He went to Stockton Wood Road Infant School, and that opened up in June 1940. Although Paul and Mike were baptized Catholics, their parents preferred a non-Catholic education. On the big day, Mike's mom was dressed in a midwife's uniform and cap, and she walked him to school, and Paul was already at the school. They met the teacher and talked, and his mom waved bye-bye and set off home. Mike said she'd forgotten one thing, him, so he started to cry and watched her through the school railings as she slowly disappeared from view. He was 5, and he said their home was only 100 yards away around the corner. And once he got all that over with, he said that school wasn't so bad. Mike remembered when he and Paul went to Stockywood to see their first movie. They were seated on long wooden benches watching crime buster Dick Barton, who was their radio hero. When it all became too much for Paul and he ran out of the theater, he was scared out of his mind. Mike said it amused him to see it. In real life, he wasn't scared of bullies, and he saved Mike a few times in the schoolyard. Mike thought big brothers were have a use after all. On balmy summer days, he and Paul would play hooky from school and go down the banks of the River Mersey, where they would take off their clothes and swim in the then unpolluted waters. Mike remembered that he and Paul were two independent little chaps, but his uncle and auntie thought they were two right little swine, always up to mischief, or with their backs to the wall saying, "We won't, we won't." Then he remembered the time that he and Paul in 72 Western were speeding up the growth of the apples by throwing stones at the apple tree, and then they denied it, but the stones on the other side gave them away. Mike remembered that he was the leader of his own gang in the Stockton Wood years, charging the enemy across the schoolyard in full war cry. A teacher said one day he would be a leader of men. He said there was an older bully that hit little girls and made them cry, so Mike had to teach him a lesson. Not long after the war, most luxury items were scarce, but somehow Jim, their father, came home one day and had the strangest things that Mike had ever seen. They were bananas. So they asked him, "What are bananas?" And Jim said, "They are delicacies." And then they asked him, "What are delicacies?" And their dad said, "Bananas are bananas." They both took a mouthful, and Mike said, "Yuck." And Jim said, "Ugh." And Mike said he nearly stuffed the bananas up their blank, but the memories are made of this. Mike said that being a midwife, which his mother was, had pros and cons. Mary was respected, and they got a council house, and she was almost like a local doctor. And one time a distraught mother arrived at their door with a screaming baby. The mother said, "I've done something terrible," and she unwrapped the blanket, and there was a large diaper pin stuck through his private part. So Mary pulled it out and dabbed the boy with a TCP disinfectant and returned the baby to the mother without a blink. The mother was unable to thank Mary enough. Mike said at least he'll be able to water the flowers easily when he grows up. So then he talked about 12 Ardwick Road. Mary wanted better for the family, and they moved to a newer estate on the outskirts of Speke. Across the house there was an open area, and there was a lime pit. And he said Dad had banned it from them ever going around it. And when it rained, it turned into an attractive swimming pool. And one day when Dad was at work and Mom was at the shops, they were on a school holiday. So Paul led the way to the pit, and they pretended they were on a pirate ship, and there was a plank of wood. But the wood got wobbly when they were on it, and Paul grabbed Mike, and they both went into the pit. They were screaming for help, and they couldn't swim. They tried to climb out and burn their hands, but it didn't help that they didn't know how to swim. And then Mike saw a stump, and he grabbed it, and he grabbed Paul. So they were treading water like rats when a passing workman heard them and yanked them out. When Dad came home and saw the two wet rats who had been in the pit, he got mad and sent them up to bed with no supper. Later that evening, Dad was passing the bottom of the stairs, and he overheard Paul whispering to Mike, "I'm going to dig a big hole in between sniffles, then I'm going to take him, Dad, he means, up in the plane, thousands of feet high, and push him in." Shortly after, Mum crept upstairs with some supper, telling them not to let Dad hear, and they ate their food in the dark. Little did they realize that their father had sent her to give them dinner. Now we come to Dick Barton, special agent. Mike said when they lived at 12 Arctic Road, he and Paul shared the same bedroom, and their dad, trying to keep them out of mischief, rigged a set of earphones from downstairs, wireless, to their beds. The earphones were hard and made of Bakelite stuff, so they put them under their pillows so they could fall asleep listening to their favorite programs. Dick Barton, Special Agent. Jim and his garden. Well, Jim loved gardening, as we know, and he eventually became secretary of Speke Horticultural Society. He had a small and productive garden at 12 Ardwick Road. He had roses, snapdragons, and dahlias. The pride of his garden was a lavender bush. Jim got mad one day when he discovered tomcats had peed on his lavender bushes. One night they heard meow, meow. The next morning Mike saw why the cat was so unhappy. Jim had placed inverted knitting needles throughout the lavender bush, and Mike said, meow. Mike said one lovely day in 1953, during the summer, their mom said for Mike and Paul to skedaddle for a couple of hours. So they readily agreed, sensing something was up. They got on their 3-speed Raleigh sports bikes. They headed for the rhododendron woods near Speke Shore. They pretended they were Tarzans swinging from the rhododendron bushes. They then went to the Aglet Shores cliffs, and they walked along the tops of the cliffs with their bikes and paid no attention to the beautiful views. Instead, they looked down in the grass to see if anybody lost money. Then they played with some Garston lads playing chicken with their bikes before they decided they wanted to go home and see what was going on. When they got there in the lounge, it was their first black and white television. Their parents were grinning, and they watched the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II with all the neighborhood because they had the first telly on the road. Now we come to the story of Ball Butt. One day outside of number 12, Paul and Mike were playing ball with a ball that Mike had found on the next road over. He said a little lad came up to him and said, "Aye, that's our ball." In those days, you didn't risk going outside your road, and if you did, it was at your own risk. Mike said he looked at the boy with great interest. 1, he wasn't from the neighborhood. 2, he was alone. And 3, he was half their size. Mike said, "You what?" The lad said, "You's got our ball." And Mike said, "So?" And the boy gave it back. "No," said Mike, hanging the ball over his head. And the boy said, "Give us it back." And Mike said, "No." The boy said, "Give it back or I'll butt you." That meant he would hit him in the forehead with his forehead. Mike said, "Try it." And with that, in a quick move, he grabbed Mike's lapels, raised himself up, and hit him between the eyes with his forehead. Mike said for a moment everything went black, and slowly back to normal, and he got his vision back. And when he did, the boy and the ball were gone. All that was left was Paul rolling on the floor laughing. Mike remembered George Harrison. He said when they lived at 12 Ardwick, he remembered a lad who lived on Upton Green a couple of roads away from them. He was a year ahead of Mike, and he was classified as one of the big lads. It was unapproachable. Mike thought he was a working-class rebel chap. Toward the end of their school days together, he got more outrageous. He didn't follow the dress uniform, and his hair was the longest anyone could get away with. George and Paul started to play guitars together, and he was invited to the house. And Mike and George got friendly with each other. George liked to wear skin-tight drainies down to his bright fluorescent socks, even brighter lime Upton Green waistcoat under his blazer. He had the first blue suede winkle picker shoes, and he also chewed gum constantly to finish his trademark. Mike said his mom must have loved him. Now Mike talks about John Lennon. Mike remembered seeing John right after his mom died. He had drainies, sideys, suities, the lot. Ivan introduced John to Paul, and he said John and his girlfriend were both blind as bats, and when he shouted hello in their direction, they would look in that direction and say hello back with a royal wave, because they really couldn't see where he was. Mike said he shared an affinity with John, even right up to the last time he saw him in New York in 1974. He said maybe it was because his mom had died too, and they shared death, and you don't have to say anything, you just know. He said maybe it was his failure at academic school, or its obvious natural artistic talent, or maybe it was because he was a natural-born rebel. Jim didn't like John and told Paul, "He'll get you into trouble, son." And while Jim was at work, John would come over and rehearse with Paul. Jim wanted to introduce Paul and Mike to his exclusive musicians-only club. Playing an instrument was a passport to popularity in their father's book. The problem was they weren't interested. They didn't like practice makes perfect on the piano. He wanted them to like some instrument if they didn't want to play the piano. And one day at Annie Jen's, their cousin Ian was having trouble playing a tune on the trumpet and asked Paul to give it a try. After a few tries, and Jim telling Paul to purse the lips, son, he played a passable tune. Cousin Ian gave the trumpet to Paul. At one time, Mike wanted to play the drums. He would play, and Paul would go down the sidewalk and see how far away he could walk before he couldn't hear the drums. It was 100 yards, Mike said. Keith Moon would have been proud. But Mike said he gave up drumming when he broke his arm and had to go through therapy, and after all that, he lost the thrill for drumming. He said that Paul started to play them while he wasn't able to, and he noticed how good Paul got with him. Mike said, listen to Paul play the drums on Band on the Run, and McCartney too. Then Paul wanted a guitar. Paul got a desire to play the guitar when the skiffle era came in with the Rock Island Line song by Lonnie Donegan. So Mike said his father loved playing the piano, and for Mike, he went from drums to banjo and gave up on both. Paul was into his guitar. He got lost in another world, especially after their mom died. It was useless trying to talk to him. Mike said that Paul would take it with him to the bogs and sometimes paddle round the bath in it. Paul would talk to his fellow musos, as Mike put it, George from school and rebel Johnny Moondog Lennon. Mike said, why not? They were nice people who also loved music. 1960, the Casbah in Hamburg. 6 months after the death of Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper, they were killed in an air crash. The Casbah opened with about 300 fans of the Quarrymen. The Quarrymen were John, Paul, George, and Stu Sutcliffe and Pete Best. And when they practiced, they played their hearts out in the semi-detached Hayman's Green, West Derby, the house of Mrs. Best. At this time, Mike was a member of the Crosby Green Methodist Youth. It was at this time, too, that Paul and the gang were asked to go to Hamburg. Paul told Mike that he had some news, and they asked us to go to Hamburg, Paul said, for stacks of money. Paul wasn't sure their dad would let him go. Mike said, let's try to persuade him together. Jim wanted Paul to go to teacher's training college. Mike said if Mum had been alive, there would have never been a start to the Beatles, and later Mike's group Scuffles. Their mum wanted them to go into one of the professions. So Paul brought the Beatles manager Alan Williams and convinced Jim to let Paul go. They went to Hamburg, and Mike went on a summer holiday to Amsterdam and Cologne. He bought his first pop-out camera with mock leather case and coal. Just before Christmas, Paul returned from Hamburg. He was skinny and had been on a diet of cornflakes and milk. They had been there for 4 months, and they played 8 hours a night and had 1 day off a week. Paul and Pete were deported when they accidentally set fire to their room. Paul went into the living room where his father was and told him and Mike how it went there. He said he'd been working really hard, and he got a new watch, boots, and an overcoat. He said they dropped the silver out of the Silver Beatles. They got group jackets with leather collars. He got a electric shaver, a blue velvet shirt with short sleeves, and a fab new Spanish guitar for only £2. So after all that, Paul had a good rest, plenty of schools, bacon buddies, and vitamins, and then they had a residency at Pete Best's Casbah. Now we come to the Cavern. Mike said the Cavern was torn down and filled back in 1973 to make an underground railway ventilation shaft. The Cavern had opened in 1957 as a jazz club by one Alan Seitner. He was a doctor's son, and he was trying to copy the bohemian jazz caves of the Parisian left bank. In 1959, Ray McFall, who was the Sittner accountant, took over the club, and he had opening acts like Acker Bilks, Paramount Jazz Band, and from America, Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee, blues artists. The Beatles were paid £3 and 10 shillings for half an hour. The Beatles first played the cave, as locals called it, in March 1961 as guests of the Blue Jeans, and they got a huge underground following after that. Mike worked at the Cavern and said it was like a Jekyll and Hyde affair. Jekyll was the tedium of the boring rehearsal after boring rehearsal, first at home when Dad was out at work, and when he was skipping work or school, and then it was on the 86 town bus carrying guitars, amplifiers, and his Colin camera, past the unloading fruit lorries in Matthew Street, and down the steep stone staircase in the dark. Opening the heavy door, they got to the dimly lit, cold, dark, arched catacomb, and he said we passed the cleaning ladies, got their cokes, and headed for the stage, over and through the wooden chairs facing towards Mecca. Then they plugged in tuned in, sat down, and tuned up. They would slow belt the numbers till everyone knew their bits, and harmonies would be worked out to perfection. They had a small Grundig tape recorder to help expose the mistakes on playback. Then they went to the Grapes pub down the street to get some energy juice down for the coming all-night session. So Mike would go get Cokes for the band when they were called on stage, and then they rehearsed. The place was cool inside, but when the place got packed with people, it was like an oven. Mike said the restrooms there were near where they got the Cokes, and it smelled like urine, sweet, and rotten fruits. Mike said he would watch Lennon. He was like a caged animal, never mind a Beatle. Mike said he had nothing against his brother, but he was just a brother. He said Lennon would stand legs apart, defying you to come up and hit him. And then he said Paul would get the girls and some of the musical lads with Till There Was You. Then he would finish with a passable Long Tall Sally. At daybreak, Paul and Mike would leave the Cavern, tireder and somewhat wiser, and get to the 86 bus stop. There they would wait for the first bus home, and Mike said it was magic days. So I'm going to end the video here. It's been a pleasure to find out more about Mike and Paul McCartney from his book, The Macs. We got to see them as mischievous boys and how great his parents were. It was also in this video we saw the beginnings of the Beatles playing in Hamburg and then getting a steady gig at the Cavern. I can't wait to see what happens next. So I hope everyone enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would help my channel out. And I appreciate all the support of my current viewers. You give me the inspiration to keep making more videos, so I'm very grateful. I've also started a place in the description area, Beatles merchandise that may be of interest, and if you like it, just click on a link and it'll take you to the Amazon page. And if you order something, I get a small commission at no cost to you. Aside from that, I want to wish everybody a great day, and I hope you will tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.